The 23rd Psalm is one of those Bible passages that just about everybody has heard of. You know, even people who don't go to church much have heard the 23rd Psalm. In fact, people who don't even believe in God have heard the 23rd Psalm a lot of times. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that it gets used at funerals a lot, and so people hear it there. But another part of it is that some of these phrases from the 23rd Psalm have already moved into common usage. You know, phrases like walking through the valley of the shadow of death, goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Those are phrases that are used in stories that have no religious content whatsoever. And so as we continue our sermon series on the Bible's greatest hits, looking at the most popular Bible verses as determined by a search at BibleGateway.com, it's really kind of surprising to me that the 23rd Psalm is not higher on the list than it is. Now, it's number 5. That's a good number. And the ones ahead of it are good verses too, and we'll be talking about them in the weeks to come. But I really would have thought that the 23rd Psalm would at least be in the top 3. And maybe it's a little lower because so many people know it that they don't need to search for it. I don't know. After all, I suspect there are some of you out here who, if I asked you, would be able to recite it from memory. I'm not going to ask, but if I did, I'll bet some of you could do it. But whenever I read the 23rd Psalm, there's something that strikes me about it. It seems that a lot of times we think of this psalm as a psalm about God, that God is the shepherd, God is the guide, God is the protector. And all of that's true. There's nothing wrong with thinking of the psalm that way. After all, this short psalm, only 6 verses long, makes 13 references to God in those 6 verses. But you know who's referred to in this psalm even more than God? Me. I mean, not me personally, of course, but I mean human beings. You and me, us. There are 16 references to I or me or my in these 6 verses. So it seems to me that this is not just the psalm about God. It is about God, but it's also a psalm about us. It's a psalm about God. It's a psalm about us. It's a psalm about our relationship with God. That's why it's kind of too bad that we associate it so much with funerals, you know. Now, it is important that we have a relationship with God at our death. But it's at least as important, if not more so, that we have a relationship with God during our lives. So what does our psalm say about our relationship with God? Well, it says it in the very first sentence. It says that God is the shepherd. And so by implication, you and I are the sheep. Now, when I grew up on the farm between Delmont and Armour, we did not raise sheep. We had cattle, we had hogs. When I was a little kid, we had some chickens. No sheep. But my understanding is that it's really not a compliment to us that we are called sheep. Sheep are not the brightest animals around, at least by reputation. In fact, it's been said that sheep are basically surprised when the sun comes up in the morning. The reason sheep need a shepherd to take care of them is that they're really not smart enough to take care of themselves, at least not the domesticated sheep that we have. And you know, when we look at our relationship with God and think of it defined that way, there are at least times when we have to admit that's just about right, don't we? I'm pretty sure all of us can think of some pretty dumb things that we've done over the course of our lives. I know I can. There are things I've done, I wonder why in the world that did not get me into all kinds of trouble. The only reason I can think of that it did not is that the Lord, the shepherd, was taking care of me, was watching over me, was protecting me in those times. And the author of our psalm seems to know that. Look what he says in verse 2. He says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures." Now we hear that, we think of this incredibly beautiful, peaceful, pastoral scene. And that's okay, but think about this. He makes me lie down in green pastures. If God has to make us lie down in green pastures, what's that mean? It means we'd never do it on our own, right? Either we'd never be able to find the green pasture in the first place, or we'd not be smart enough to stay there once we found it. Can you think of times when that applies to your life? I suspect some of us can. We've had times when we stayed too long in a place that we should have left. We stayed in a brown pasture rather than looking for something better. And we've also had times when we did not realize how good we had things. We refused to stay in a green pasture. Instead, we left it for something that was not nearly as good. So what's that show? It shows that there are times when we need the courage to leave a place to find something better. And it shows there are also times when we need to have the wisdom to stay in a good place rather than taking a foolish risk. So how do we tell the difference? How do we know whether it's time to move on or time to stay? Well, look at verse 3. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. The way we tell the difference is by letting God guide us. God will let us know whether it's time to move or time to stay. And if it is time to move, God will tell us which way to go. We always know we're on the right path if we follow where God guides us to go. And that sounds good. But then we say, but how do I let God guide me? How do I hear God telling me whether it's time to move on or time to stay? How do I know what God is guiding me to do? Well, how do the sheep know? The sheep know by staying close to the shepherd, right? If the sheep wander too far off, they will not see the shepherd, they'll not hear the shepherd, they won't know what the shepherd wants them to do. But if they stay close to the shepherd will show them where to go, will nudge them back onto the path if they start to stray off course. So how do we stay close to God the shepherd? Well, you know the answer to that one as well as I do. We pray, we read the Bible, we do the things that keep God a constant part of our lives. And we don't just do those things once in a while when we get into trouble. We do them every day so that God will be a constant part of our lives. But of course, it's one thing to know where God is guiding us to go, and it's another thing to actually go there, right? Because sometimes if we follow God, God is going to take us out of our comfort zone. Sometimes God is going to ask us to do some things that we have never done before. Sometimes God is going to do some things we really don't want to do. In fact, God may ask us to do some things that scare us. And the author of our psalm recognizes that. Look at verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. See, the psalm recognizes that following God is not always going to be easy. Following God may take us into some really dark, scary places sometimes. It may take us to places where all kinds of things could happen. And yet, we don't have to be afraid. Why not? Because God is with us, and God will protect us. So the question is, do we trust God enough to follow, even when God guides us into those dark valleys? Are we going to follow even when God guides us into places that scare us? Will we trust God enough to believe that God will bring us through those dark valleys? Or when we see the dark valley ahead, will we leave the shepherd and go off on our own way? And God leaves that choice up to us. But the psalm does give us some incentive to follow. Because what happens when we follow God through those dark valleys? God leads us out to the other side. God leads us out of the darkness and into the light. And when that happens, God's goodness and mercy will follow us all the days of our lives. And we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But we only get there if we follow the shepherd. The only way to get through to get to those green pastures is if we follow God through the dark valleys. So really it comes down to two things. One, are we willing to do whatever it takes to stay close enough to God to know where God is leading us? And number two, if we are we willing to trust God enough to actually go there even when it's a place we don't want to go? We need to answer that question from a couple different perspectives. We need to answer it as individuals, and we need to answer it as a church. And so what I ask all of us to do, including me, is to make God a constant part of our lives. I ask us all to pray for God's guidance. Pray for God to guide us as individuals. Pray for God to guide us as a church. And it's going to take some time probably, but if we consistently pray for God to help us open our hearts and open our minds to God, again, both as individuals and as a church, if we do that consistently, God will hear and God will respond. And also pray that God will give us the trust and the courage and the love to follow where God guides us. Pray that we will trust God enough to follow God even when God is leading us to do things that make us uncomfortable, even things that scare us. Pray that we will trust God enough to believe that if we go where God is leading us to go, we will eventually get to those green pastures, even if we cannot see the green pasture right now. Pray that we will do that as individuals, and pray that we will do that as a church. God is our shepherd. If we sheep will just follow the shepherd will provide us with everything that we need. If we all make God our guide, if we all have enough trust to follow God wherever God leads us, you and I and the entire church and our entire parish will get to those green pastures. Amen.